that volume? Is it all right? Uh, Thank you, Lindy. Thank you, SWOP, for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you are enjoying your lunch. We made a big effort to decolonize our lunch in the interest of aligning it to my talk today. So a big thank you to Chef Mantis for working with some unfamiliar indigenous ingredients and designing a beautiful menu. And I also want to thank Sipiwe Sitole of African Marmalade Farm, who supplied most of these indigenous ingredients and who is a big proponent of reviving these foods. I also want to mention that there were booklets out front in multiple languages, and I know that there weren't enough. So if anyone didn't get one, they are available free for download on the website wewillalleat.org. So in English, Chivenda, Setswana, and isiZulu, you can download them for free from wewillalleat.org. And the poster that you see comes out of the booklet. Right, so let's jump into the topic, the coloniality of the South African food system and the contemporary food crisis. My talk today is going to trace the history of the contemporary food crisis back to its colonial origins. So I will start with a look at pre-colonial indigenous foodways and then how they were violently disrupted by colonialism and the kind of food system that was put in their place. And then moving forward to present times, how these processes of disruption continue today, the coloniality of our current food system and how this underpins the food crisis. And to end with a little bit of hope, I will look at a few seeds of decoloniality that I see in the food system today. I've depicted this with jagged lines because the process of the unfolding of colonialism was not a neat process. It was uneven and violent as it spread over space and time in what is now South Africa. And of course, it was resisted and contested every step of the way. I want to offer a warning for this talk that it will contain descriptions of violence and also racist language drawn from the archives. I have sanitized some of it, but I wanted to be true to the character of the Eurocentrism that I'm talking about, so just be warned of that. I'm covering too much material in the amount of time that I have, so I apologize if some of it goes along a bit quickly and is not as in-depth as it should be, but hopefully we can dive back into those parts in the discussion. So just to quickly define a few concepts before we jump in, I'm talking about the food system, which hopefully is familiar, but it's basically all of those activities which you see across the top of that slide there, from the production to the processing, selling, and consumption of food, as well as the systems that influence those activities, whether it's the biological or ecological systems and other systems, and then the outcomes of those activities, so whether we have food security or insecurity, for example. The topic of foodways comes more from the sort of anthropological literature, and that's more about the sort of social, cultural, and historical aspects of food and the food system. Okay. Apologies if anyone has trouble with blinking. I don't know how we fix that, but we might just have to deal with it. So foodways are more around sort of the cultural aspects of the food system. And indigenous foodways specifically are referring to the complex, holistic, and integrated meanings of food in indigenous worldviews. So coloniality, which is in the title of the talk, refers to the patterns of power that emerged through colonialism, but which continue past the end of colonial administration. So how those are still in place today. And then I just want to make one note around my use of the term indigenous in this talk. It is not that commonly used in a South African context, and it can be a little bit complicated, but I am using it to refer to all of the African populations who were in the territory of what is now South Africa between the 16th and the 19th centuries, recognizing, of course, that there were many different groups with different lineages and different histories in this space, but I don't want to engage in firstism. I just want to recognize that all of those groups' foodways were violently disrupted by settler colonialism. So very briefly, the research that I've been doing has had two strands. Firstly, historical research, and unfortunately there are no written records other than perhaps rock art of pre-colonial foodways. So that means relying on the accounts of Europeans starting in the 1500s, before the Dutch East India Company officially settled at the Cape, as well as accounts of travelers, colonial officials, missionaries, and other Europeans, all of whom do give us some glimpses of indigenous foodways. They also do give accounts of the colonial violence, and they display extreme Eurocentrism, which is both offensive and useful for understanding how these processes unfolded. So sometimes one has to read against the grain, and keeping in mind that these narrators are rather unreliable, but still provide us with useful information. And then that knowledge is complemented with interviews with traditional knowledge holders, mostly elders, who are still holding and practicing knowledge around traditional foodways and passing it down, and still experiencing disruption of that knowledge. I don't know if you can see the dots very well on the map, but I've done research with the Amadiba community in the Eastern Cape, many different parts of Limpopo, Venda, also around Lepalale, Polokwane, Kiani, and then in KZN around Hawik, Mpopomeni, also Mtubatuba, and some around the Johannesburg area. I basically go wherever I can find elders who will talk to me. So let's dive into what indigenous foodways looked like before they were disrupted. This material draws from historical texts, as I mentioned, which do give quite a lot of information on what foods were consumed, sometimes how they were procured or prepared and shared. But I want to focus on the values and principles that underpinned indigenous food systems. And while there were many different groups in South Africa at that time, I focus on just a few who are mentioned a lot in the early colonial literature, so the San and the Khoikhoi in the Western Cape, the Xhosa in the Eastern Cape, and Tswana in Ditakong, which is now Northern Cape. So drawing on these many references, we can distinguish a bunch of different sort of values and principles underpinning foodways. And those include extensive knowledge of plants, animals, and seasonal cycles, a deep sense of interconnectedness with the natural world, a strong sense of gratitude that is often expressed through rituals and ceremonies around either times of hunting or times of planting and harvest, hospitality shown towards visitors, sharing of food within the community, not producing waste, storing food for emergencies or difficult times, work undertaken collectively, not individually, and communal use of resources. I hesitate to use the word property at all because that is not how things were generally seen. So I just drew a few quotes from different sources. A British official noticed how a Khoikhoi person will at any time share his last morsel with his companions. A missionary watched both the Xhosa and Khoikhoi people find honey by following the honeybird, and noted that when they have, by the aid of this little creature, found and plundered a hive, they usually leave it a portion. And out of gratitude for its services, the Khoikhoi are particularly careful never to shoot this bird, nor will they on any account plunder or destroy its nest. So a strong sense of interconnection and gratitude. The same missionary noticed that amongst the Xhosa, the planting calendar was determined by natural cycles, 3 particular signs in nature which had to do with the flowering of specific trees or the changing of the colors of those trees. And William Burchell noted amongst the Batlaping, which is the Tswana in the north, the land was held communally as the common property of the whole tribe to pasture the herds. So try to keep these values and principles in mind as we proceed to a very different set of values. This is where more of the violence takes place. So these indigenous foodways were disrupted by colonialism in horrific and multiple ways. And the most extreme of those was, of course, actual physical violence and destruction. And there were various kinds of violence, which began right at the beginning of the Dutch East India Company's settlement at the Cape in 1652, as they seized land, forcibly removed people from it, and then defended their land and cattle, which had been classified as property, which had not been property when they were under indigenous control. So while the Dutch were initially welcomed with hospitality, which was the way of the Khoi people they found at the Cape, very soon indigenous people realized what was happening and began to resist. And so they began to steal the cattle from the Dutch. And Van Riebeck asked a local translator called Doman why this was happening, and then wrote down in his diary, the explanation that he received, which was, "They saw that we were breaking up the best land and grass where their cattle were accustomed to graze, trying to establish ourselves everywhere with houses and farms, as if we were never more to remove, but designed to take for our permanent occupation more and more of this Cape country, which had belonged to them from time immemorial." In other words, indigenous people saw exactly what was happening and complained about it to Jan van Riebeeck, who wrote it down, ignored them, and decided in response that permission was given to all of the settlers to either capture or shoot any indigenous people who stole cattle. So there was a bounty put on the heads of men, women, and children, and because in addition to being violent and colonial, he was also extremely patriarchal, the bounty on women and children was half price. So a second form of violence that emerged as the colony extended northwards and eastwards was the commando, and this was sometimes informal and sometimes a formal militia, often formed of predominantly farmers who were living near the frontiers. And they were allegedly protecting their farms and their cattle from theft. But in reality, what they were doing was seizing more land, more cattle, and more labor for their farms. So as one trader observed when he saw this happening, the cattle were swept off, villages burned, the inhabitants massacred, and what was perhaps the worst feature in the case, the women and children, and often the men, were dragged away to become forced laborers, in fact slaves on the Dutchmen's farms. The picture is from a newspaper in London in the late 1800s, representing commandos and the fires that they set. And this was obviously extremely destructive to people's ability to survive at all, but also to maintain their traditional foodways, whether it was herding or foraging or agriculture. And then a third form of violence was actual warfare. So there were many fully fledged wars between colonizers and indigenous peoples. And if we take the example of the 100+ year long Xhosa Wars between the British and then Xhosa in the Eastern Cape, there was a specific famine policy used by the British above and beyond military force, which involved scorched earth tactics, destroying homes, grain, crops, livestock, and ensuring that the Xhosa were unable to plant new crops so that they would face starvation and be forced into submission and into the labor force on white farms. So all of these forms of violence are horrifying and show how utterly people were unable to stay on the land and with the resources that they needed for food. So the violence was the worst form of disruption, but there were other forms as well. And key amongst those was Eurocentrism. So that is an ideology that sees Europe as the source of all progress and science and rationality and the best place in the world against which all other places and peoples should be measured. And Eurocentrism was used to spread capitalism through imperialism. And food was critical to the way Eurocentrism did this in terms of informing these tropes of the savage native and the idle native, which were then used to justify violence and land theft. So beginning even before settlement at the Cape, when sailors would pass by and stop to replenish on their way to and from Asia engaging in the spice trade, they would comment on the foodways of indigenous people that they found. So one sailor wrote, "It is a great pity that such creatures as they be should enjoy so sweet a country. Raw suet and raw blood and diverse other things they eat, which is most beastly to behold." And another one wrote, "For the soil about the bay it seems to be very good, but the sun shines not upon a people in the world more barbarous than those which possess it. These brutes devote themselves to idleness, for they neither dig nor spin." So those two quotes are first of all equating indigenous peoples to animals, which in the European hierarchy of being was very low. It is indicating that they don't deserve the land that they occupy because either they eat things that Europeans consider disgusting or they don't work hard enough in agriculture and manufacturing the way Europeans believe one should work. So these become excuses for taking the land. And I just want to highlight the role of missionaries in the spread of Eurocentrism, and particularly in internalized racism and internalized Eurocentrism. Because when missionaries came, they went well above and beyond spreading Christianity to use a combination of kindness, indoctrination, and force to spread European ways of living, European ways of dress, European ways of farming and eating and everything else. And they recognized that they were part of the colonial project. So John Philip, one missionary, wrote, "Wherever the missionary places his standard among a savage tribe, their prejudices against the colonial government give way. Their dependence upon the colony is increased by the creation of artificial wants. And then industry, trade, and agriculture spring up." So he's highlighting very clearly the role of the missionaries in the colonial project and how by creating demand for things like coffee, tea, sugar, cloth, and other European goods, it improves the ability of the colony to control the territory and also to benefit economically from it. A third form of disruption of indigenous foodways is the disruption of intergenerational knowledge transmission. And so if we think about how knowledge around food was passed down from one generation to the next, it was through observation and experience. It was embodied learning experience. And so if you separate adults from children, or you separate either of them from the land, then this chain of transmission is broken. So that happened in a number of ways as well under colonialism, starting with schooling, which was often missionary schooling, which removed children from their families and from the land and taught them European ways of doing things. But the teachers tended to worry that they would return to their vicious practices of heathenism if they went home from school. A second way was taxation. So Cecil Rhodes thought that through taxation, the lazy Africans would be forced to work, and they would be removed from a life of sloth and laziness and learn the dignity of labor, and also make them contribute to the prosperity of the state. So by imposing taxes, people who were perfectly self-sufficient and living good lives were forced to come up with cash, which up to then they didn't have. So they would either have to go work for Europeans, or they would have to switch their own home production from subsistence, feeding their family, to cash crops so that they could earn cash. And this also is part of the origins of the migrant labor system, which also interrupted collective food production in the family because family members who are supposed to be laboring in the fields are no longer present. There was also a lot of forced labor, both in terms of kidnapping children and forcing them into indentured labor, as well as things like vagrancy laws, which criminalized people's presence in their own land. And they then either had to pay cash fines or do forced labor as their penalty, either way resulting in them having to work for Europeans. So all of this was extremely painful and vicious and extreme disruption, and made it virtually impossible for people to continue producing food and living on the land in the way that they had for centuries. And so then I want to move on to what was imposed over the indigenous food systems that had existed before. The colonial system was very, very different. And I think this image, which shows a farm and a lot of people with weapons, feels about right. I've got a quote there from a dispatch which was sent by the Dutch East India Company to Jan van Riebeeck in 1657. It's extremely typical of their communications. There are many, many, many similar ones in the extensive body of communication. The Dutch East India Company reminds him that the reason why the settlement exists and why he is there is to raise for the crews of the company's ships the needful supplies of fruits and vegetables and meat. So to feed the ships, that is the point of being there. And they also remind him that he needs to diminish the great expense which has been incurred by reaping profit from every honorable source. Honorable includes slavery for some reason, whether it's agriculture, internal trade, or foreign commerce. So profit is really the basis of the entire settlement, both when it's under the Dutch East India Company and later under the British, to the benefit of both colonial and European elites. So there are a lot of schemes that happen in the early days around what kinds of things can be exported for profit: hides, seal fat, the mythical gold, many ideas. And it is also very much about the needs of the empire and not the local population. So they are there to produce food to supply ships, or to export that grain to other colonies or back to Europe, and not specifically to feed local populations. A third principle of the colonial food system is forced labor. So There are enslaved people in the beginning, as well as indentured people, as well as prisoners and captives. But the kinds of plantation agriculture that are imposed by the Dutch and the British involve large plantations and forced labor. And finally, Eurocentrism, of course, informs not only the violence, but also the food system. So from 1652, at the company's gardens, the very first crops planted are European crops like wheat and grapes for wine, and many other crops that the Europeans bring from other colonies in other parts of the world. They also impose their own farming practices. And most fundamentally, the worldview that underpins the kind of farming that the Europeans bring is the Enlightenment rational idea of separation between man and nature, and man with a capital M, Enlightenment, white man. And so it's an idea of dominating nature as opposed to being interconnected with the natural world and imposing your will. And many times in the early years, the company's gardens gets flattened by storms and blown away in the wind, and they just keep doing it again and again and again in the way that they do. So if we jump up to the present, hundreds of years later, sadly very little has changed. So something that is truly a miracle is the fact that despite all of this violence and all of this disruption, some people in this country still hold traditional and indigenous knowledge, and they are still able to practice it and pass it down to their children. And that is truly a miracle. This is one such elder who is now over 100 years old and is still growing her own food and manually processing some of it herself, although mostly her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren do that for her. So unfortunately, we see that there is still violent dispossession. So I interviewed a man whose family had a farm of their own in Limpopo, and then post-democracy, they lost that farm. So he explained that when the young girls went to fetch water, the white boys had guns and shot at them, resulting in the water spilling, and they would kill dogs in the yards. They said, let's chase these ones out so that we can take away the land. And those people did take away the land, and he and his family were displaced. And then they lost access to the foods that they produced and harvested on that land. So he says, there was a lot of morojo in the wild we used to eat. You would not be able to see them here anymore. Now we do not have morojo, we do not have food, we are starving where we are because we have to go buy it. I do not have enough room to farm so that my children can eat. He is one of many people who have been evicted off of their land. His family actually had their own land. Others are farm workers who constantly face eviction. So one of them told me how he was unable to work because he was sick, and the farmer kicked him out and told him to leave the farm. And that happened very unceremoniously and virtually immediately, in a way that his family had no time to prepare and nowhere to go. So not only do they lose their work and the plot of land that they use to supplement their food, but also it means they lose their cattle because they have nowhere to take them when they leave the farm. And finally, while we don't have as many missionaries in South Africa today, there are still issues around the church and the way it continues to separate people from their traditional knowledge. And so quite a number of people explained to me that even though they know wild plants that they can gather for medicine when they don't feel well, they no longer do so because their church forbids them to. So that kind of disruption continues as well. And if we look at the food system that we have today, we might think it's very different because we go into shiny, air-conditioned supermarkets with packaged foods, and that looks nothing like the foodways from hundreds of years ago. But in fact, in terms of the values, it is very much the same. So it is still profit-oriented, and this became painfully obvious in 2020 when the country was on lockdown and about half of households ran out of money to buy food, but during that time, the big retailers continued to report profits. So we know that this food system is not around nourishing the population, it is around profit. We continue to produce for the needs of empire, only now we call it world markets. And in South Africa, 90% of the fruit that we grow is exported, a lot of it to Europe. And this is at the same time that the majority of South African children do not consume anywhere near the recommended daily amount of fruits that they need for their health. It is still founded on exploitation of labor as well, and while it's not slavery today, the conditions of farm workers are not that much better. And likewise, workers in food processing and retail are extremely exploited. And finally, it is also still grounded in Eurocentrism. So if you think of what Chef Mantis said earlier, how she was unfamiliar with working with these ingredients. Many of you might be unfamiliar with eating some of these ingredients. Why do we not eat the foods of this land? Why is it that what's available in a shop or in a restaurant is food from elsewhere? And the narrative around European progress and scientific rationality also continues to inform food production in terms of large-scale monocultures using high technology these days, as well as chemical inputs. And it also informs food processing to create ultra-processed foods for our convenience, and then pretty shiny things for marketing them to us. So unfortunately, all of the values of the contemporary food system indicate that it is still very much a colonial system. And add to that, of course, the fact that the land has not been given back, so the theft of the land remains in place. So this system is what underpins the contemporary food crisis. And I would say that this crisis is a health crisis, an environmental crisis, and also a crisis of injustice. And I think these days most of us are familiar with some of this because since COVID times, it has started to be reported in the media, even though it definitely predates COVID times. So we know, for example, that more than half of households cannot afford healthy diets, that more than a quarter of children under 5 experience stunting, so they're not reaching their full potential. And at the same time, there are rising levels of diet-related non-communicable diseases like diabetes and hypertension and others, because the only foods that people can afford to eat are not healthy. And then this is also linked to mental health concerns because food insecurity causes extreme anxiety, depression, and as we've seen in the media lately, suicide as well. It's also an environmental crisis. This European modernist food system that we have contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, it contributes to pollution, it involves toxic agrochemicals which harm human and animal health. It involves a large amount of packaging, much of which ends up in the ocean or landfills. 70% of the very scarce water that we have in this country goes to agricultural production. And then on top of all of that, about 30% of the food produced in the country is wasted, meaning it doesn't get to the people who are hungry and need to eat it. So all of those resources go into this production, and then the food goes to landfill, where it then releases more greenhouse gas emissions. So this is clearly not a good system, and what it speaks to is the injustice of it, right? The extremely unequal distribution of benefits and harms of this system. And if you are Black and a woman and poor in this country, you are likely to be experiencing the harms. And if you are white and male and wealthy, you are more likely to be experiencing the benefits. The system is also extremely concentrated all along that value chain that we saw in the beginning. So whether it's the producers of agrochemicals or fertilizer, whether it's the processors and manufacturers, or whether it's the retailers, you have just a few actors, large corporates, who control each segment of the chain and who make large profits, while smaller scale producers, processors, and retailers are excluded, and while the majority of the population is unable to afford what they are making. I'm going to skip over the quotes here of how people are experiencing this, just in the interest of the time. But people are well aware that this system doesn't work and experience it as a problem. They just don't always know what to do. So now that everyone is depressed, let me end with just a little bit of hope. Some seeds of decoloniality. If we accept that the roots of the contemporary food crisis are its coloniality, then it's through decolonizing the food system that we hopefully can address that crisis and improve the situation. So we can understand decoloniality as an overarching project of remembering, meaning putting things back together, aimed at addressing problems of colonization of the mind, alienation, and fragmentation. It's a restorative recovery project. So this is not about swapping out your bread and replacing it with millet, although that is also good. It's about really rethinking the values that underpin the food system. So a few examples of things that might give us hope, starting in the top left and going counterclockwise. That's the community of Kolobeni, the Amadiba community, who have been strongly resisting extractive projects in their land so that they can hold on to their traditional foodways and their traditional connection to the land and water where they live. Below that are 2 indigenous knowledge holders, the late Gogolkom Tetwa, who taught me a lot about indigenous food, and Sipiwe Sitole, who supplied much of your lunch, sharing their knowledge with others wherever they can. And the other side was a very joyful and celebratory farmer food and seed fair in KZN recently, at which elders and young people shared and traded traditional seeds and foods and food knowledge in a way that keeps the traditions alive, passes them on, and shows how much celebration and joy there should be around traditional food. And then on the other top there, that's a community mapping exercise in which elders shared their memories of the food systems from their childhoods and then engaged with younger people on how these could be brought back or incorporated into contemporary food systems. And so I just want to end with what I propose are sort of 3 R's of decolonizing the food system. The first of those is recognition. I think there needs to be a lot more recognition of this history and of the harm that was done, and that is what I've been trying to do with this work and with this talk. The second is restitution, and I mean real restitution, so giving back the land and the control over the natural resources, but also, in addition, symbolic restitution for purposes of healing. And thirdly, reimagination. So it is obviously not possible for us to push rewind and go back in time 400 years and change history or revert to systems that existed then. We might not want to. Some of us are quite attached to our technology. But what it is possible to do is learn lessons from those times and understand the values that informed those food systems, and then use those to reimagine what we do today moving forward so that we can have better food systems that actually feed and nourish everyone. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much, Brittany, for giving this talk. We now have 30 minutes for discussion, so I'll get up and come around if anyone has any questions. Just to say, we will wrap up by 2:30 sharp so that people who have places to go can get where they're going. On the way out, you may want to pick up a poster. They are outside. So yes, I'll take a few questions if we have. Okay. Let's start here. Then we'll go back.
Thanks, Brittany, for that very informative presentation. I guess the question that I'm sure that has been asked of you and others that are involved in this work and people is scale. How, just to address the issue, because obviously, industrial capitalism, modern capitalism is a massification. It started with vehicles, started with everything, and this mass production. The population, you saw the census that's just been released. We've gone from 2011 from 52 million to 64 million in less than 12 years. And we're going to go to another 80, 100 million, and it's all across our continent. So how is it in terms of the way in which the restoration, the restitution, everything, that one can begin to try to do these things, but on a scale which provides for the increasing population? Thanks.
Brittany, would you like to respond to that or get a couple more? Okay, I'm going to go here and then I'm going to come to you.
Thanks. Chef Mantis, the food was excellent today. I mean, it always is, but it was really, really great. Thanks for your talk. I have a very simple question. It's just around the whether it's useful for you at all to consider an urban-rural divide in your work, and how you think that plays out, both in terms of the values that you talk about that underpin the food systems, but also in terms of the types of food and food practices.
Hi. I was interested in the question you raised of restitution, and given the food system that we have in this country, how do we unpin the reliance on supermarkets, on high input agriculture, on government protection of these areas of the food system, and how do we turn it round so that it favors smaller producers at household level who are not using harmful inputs into the land, but are using non-GMOs and non-organic chemical fertilizers and to honor their respect for the traditional systems, for seed swapping, for provision of food in their communities, which we don't see very much of. Everyone is a prisoner of what I call the corporate capture of agriculture and the food system. We need to undo all that, and can you make some suggestions? Thank you.
Okay, let's give Brittany a chance to respond to those questions, and then I've noted a hand here, and okay, we'll get that.
Right. Those are not necessarily easy questions to answer. I'll start by saying that thankfully I don't have to have all of the answers. The goal of switching to a more collective and communal and democratic system and localized system as well is that people come up with the answers themselves together. And so I think, part of this is about devolving those decisions to communities who are in different spaces with different geographies, climates, food preferences, and so forth, to make the decisions themselves and have their own kinds of systems. But I will try to answer the question. So scale, Dale. The corporate industrial food system uses this narrative of we feed the world and how will we feed a population of 10 billion to insist that they are the only system that is viable, right? That we need agrochemicals, that we need the entire seed system to be dominated by 3 mega corporates because it's the only way that we will feed the growing population. But they control the system now and they are not feeding the population, right? And it is not that they couldn't. It is possible to produce large amounts of food in this way, but a system organized for profit will never feed everyone as long as there is inequality in the world and people don't have access to the funds to get the food. So in South Africa, half of the population is not accessing the food. 30% of the food is thrown away rather than being given away at the end because people can't afford to buy it. So their system does not feed the world, and they try to present other systems, so things like agroecology and territorial markets, small-scale farmers markets, as unviable for feeding the population, but they can feed the population, and the research suggests that they do feed the population much more than we think, because a lot of that large-scale agriculture is going towards things like biofuels or feed for industrial livestock production and other non-food uses. So it would mean, for example, that more people should probably be involved in food production than they currently are. Over the years, less and less people are involved in farming, for example, and also in the processing as it has become mechanized. So more people should have jobs in those areas, but frankly, in an unemployment context like the one that we have here, more jobs seem like a really good idea. So I think in technical terms, agroecology has been demonstrated to be able to feed more people. Organizing things locally can work. You shift from profit to nourishment as a goal of the food system and health, and then you are able to produce at scale. And you don't have to send the food. I mean, the way our food goes now, someone might grow maize in the US, and then they send that maize to China where it feeds livestock, and then those livestock are processed in a third country, and then they are sold in packaging in a fourth country. So if you remove all of that and all of the waste, then we're more than capable of producing enough food. And that links somewhat to Tasneem's question as well in terms of urban-rural. I mean, you definitely see differences in the South African context between what we are used to eating in Joburg and what people are used to eating in various small towns or villages or rural areas, but not as much as it might be, because if there's any single system that has penetrated even the most far-flung areas of this country, it's the system that distributes Coca-Cola and knickknacks. I don't know how they do it, but they are everywhere. So, so the differences are not as great as they could be. And as social grants have spread and as labor migration has taken people off of their land, in addition to the loss of land, there's less production in rural areas as well. And so even though people might be in a rural area, it doesn't mean that they're self-sufficient, that they're growing their own food, that they're eating traditional food anymore. And so I think we want to apply these values to all areas. Now, cities may not be able to produce all of their own food if they are conglomerates of so many people in a small space. But cities can produce some of their food, and do. We have farmers all around Joburg. And then obviously there would be relationships of exchange with rural areas, but based on much fairer terms than the ones that currently extract resources from the rural areas and channel them into profits of corporations. And then in terms of David's question on restitution and how we get out of this system, I mean, these are all related. I certainly don't have all the answers to that. And people are trapped. And because of all of the harm and damage that was done, not only in the food system, but in every system in this country, it is not like people are just able to go and choose other foods, right? The majority of people have access to whatever is in front of them and whatever little bit of that they can afford. And so this is not one of those talks where I say, eating is a political act, although it is, and make your choices with your dollars or your rands or your fork, which you should if you have the privilege to be able to do so. The majority of people do not have that privilege, and so it's about changing all of the systems. So this requires policy, of course, and after a whole lot of foot dragging, the South African government is working on an agroecology policy at the moment. We shall see what happens with that. At present, all of the support goes to industrial farming. All of the sort of discounts and benefits through things like trade incentives and export incentives go to large-scale production and large-scale retail. And the Competition Commission is also jumping in here to try to shift the balance a little more towards, for example, small-scale retailers who are not allowed to sell in places where the big supermarkets operate. So we need a lot of policies that will shift things in a different direction, shift the balance of power, so that then we can make other choices that we might want to make but are currently unable to make. And that also perhaps means things like a very large basic income grant, so that in the face of all of this unemployment, people are able to purchase food, and that it maybe isn't given out inside of the supermarket, but in the kinds of markets where grants used to be given out, where small-scale retailers could then access some of that money, because currently it's just subsidizing the supermarkets. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and take more questions.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the talk and for the food, as folks have said. I'm curious about two things that you said and how your interlocutors particularly are approaching these questions. So the first one is the industrialization of the food market and the way in which what is produced is based on capitalism, right? On demand. And, you know, you offered examples of subsidies from the federal government or like agroecology programs. But I wonder to what extent any transition is feasible under like late stage racial capitalism. And I'm curious how your folks are thinking about that. And then the second thing you said was about the right to land and giving back the land, right? Decolonizing the land. I think Benny is such an interesting example because, as you mentioned, right, that's exactly the tenets through which they're fighting are about the right to land and indigeneity. But I'm curious about, you know, where people who have already been dispossessed are located now. I come from Detroit, where there's a lot of urban farming as part of larger Afrofuturist projects. But we can farm there, but there's also a huge problem of brownfields. And I think what I've noticed in places where I visited, like in Khayelitsha or in Durban Deep, like the land is just not tenable to grow things. Like it's sand, there's huge amounts of mineral deposits that are toxic. So I'm curious, what does giving back the land look like when folks are already dispossessed and located in communities where even if they wanted to build like local agriculture, it would be complicated. I'm curious how, not just particularly your the folks that you collaborate with are thinking about those things. Thank you.
Thanks, Brittany. So on a very practical local level, on campus, trying to create food pathways for students who are hungry on campus, we have food gardens. At one time, they were really very good. This was pre-COVID, but they've been decimated, and we're really trying to get them going again. But we find it really difficult because right now we are dependent on big food, right, for donations of non-perishable food. Obviously, we're at their mercy whether they pull, the level of donations or reduce it. So we're at their mercy. But we've mapped out the whole of the university, right, for food. And we have several gardens on the campus. Just today, I gave a student cabbage and morojo from one of the gardens. But we're not producing enough food, and we're in the process of hiring a farmer. But people who applied for the position do not have agroecology, right? So we have Zimbabwean people who have agroecology, and of course we need to look at employment equity and all the rest as policies of the university. But we will get to that point where we will have a farmer, and then it means basically people have to get involved in creating those pathways and then linking with communities as well and sharing food. We can't get students to really work in the gardens. John Zira, who's one of your writers here, he's our trainer. And we can't get people to really see the need for growing their own food. People coming from rural communities, students, feel that they've done that. They've worked the land, they come here, they want McDonald's. How do we get people to, we have to break our dependence on big food right here, right now. And how are we going to do that to get students to really take control of these gardens, that's their food?
We can take one more. Okay, maybe two more. Just checking the time here. Okay, no, we're still good.
Thank you, Brittany. I just hope that this kind of food will dominate our food supply here at Tibet University. I really enjoy it. Thank you very much. I had the privilege to attend a summit on green economy in Chwane just before the pandemic. I met a lady. I just remember now the name, Joy. I don't remember the surname. She revolutionized, the way you produce food with a technique called umgibe. She's based in KZN in Devon. I don't know if you know her. If you don't, I would like you to contact her so that we may have research on that technique, because I found it can, if it's widespread, it can provide enough food, be it here, be it all over, because it's a technique, according to what she explained to me, it's the technique based on producing food indoors. We don't need the land. We just have to use plastics. We put soil in it, and food will grow indoors, inside the house, buildings, for example. I found it very, very striking. So that's what my recommendation. I don't know much about Mungibe, but as you are a specialist, please favor your research on that technique, and it's organic food. It's very, very interesting. Organic food. Thank you very much.
Okay, there are three more questions, but I think Brittany, let's hand over to you before we.
Right. Okay. Maybe just starting with the last one. I do know Nonhlanhla Joy of Umgibe. and she has done amazing things with producing chemical-free produce in KZN all over the place in a system she devised using old plastics from the supermarket that are elevated above the ground because the chickens and the dogs were eating the produce, and this protects them. Obviously, there are some environmental concerns around the plastic bags, although I think she's been working on alternative substances as well. And she has gone around training a lot of young people in farming, which is wonderful. I personally am partial to food grown in the earth. That is how the natural world designed it to be. And given the choice, I would choose to have my food grown out of the ground. But there is not always a choice. And in urban areas and other complicated situations, she's developed a really interesting system. Right. Let me just work backwards. So Karuna, so many things to engage with there. To my mind, a decolonized education would not only be free, it would also include lunch. So I think the next time we decide to protest here, we should be demanding not only free decolonized education, but free decolonized meals that enable people to learn and study. However, under the current situation, yes, we are totally dependent on big food for donations of whatever they choose to give us. And there is land on campus, and potentially a lot, of course, if the university chose to make all of that land available. But yes, it is also very true that people don't want to farm. That is very understandable for so many reasons. People are often punished with agricultural tasks, particularly in rural areas and at school, so then you associate it with punishment. It is hard work, particularly if the farming is not agroecological. If you're using this sort of mainstream ways of farming, you're trying to fight against nature, and guess what? We can't win, right? That's what nature keeps showing us with climate change. We can't win. So we need to stop fighting nature and work with nature, and that kind of farming, it's easier. It might take some setup, but it's actually easier over the long haul because you are working with the natural systems instead of against them. And it kind of does its own thing. It's also understandable if we speak to this colonization of the mind, right? The rural was portrayed as backward. Farming is portrayed as menial. So people want to move away from those things to what is modern, and they want to see progress. And so all of those deeply colonial and Eurocentric narratives need to be challenged, and that's not easy. But then if on top of it we're singling out students who need the food, who are literally hungry, and then they have to go and do the manual labor, I mean, not deliberately, but if they need to do that to get access to the food, then of course they may not have the strength. You want to look different and be singled out. And being a student is a lot of work, so you may not have extra time to devote to the gardens. But I think, things like that festival, so sort of bringing joy back into the fields, and then making the farming easier through agroecology is one way that people can start to perhaps reconnect with the land and undo some of the trauma associated with farming and the land, and perhaps come to want to do it. But in the short term, it will require farmers and pay and all of that, and those farmers will require more training from John and Zira until it gets to the point where more people know how to do that and it's easier. And also the campus the university should pay for a lot of farmers to be doing that on a lot more of the grounds. The landscaping is beautiful, but we could replace a lot of these flowers with food and feed a lot more people. And so going back to the other land question, I don't necessarily know what giving it back looks like, of course, just that it needs to go back. And I think those are things that everyone needs to be involved in discussing. It's not for me to dictate what that looks like. I have engaged with a lot of people who live very near the land they were displaced from, and the land that they were removed from. And so in a lot of cases, that's pretty easy, right? Someone else has that land, but they are right there. People should be able to go back onto that land. And that land might be under the control of a large-scale industrial white farmer, or many of those farmers are shifting into game because it's easier, so it's a game farm now. But that land was farmed, could be farmed, and could easily be given back. In terms of some of the toxic areas that have been polluted through extractives or are polluted because they are urban and have been exposed to years and years of pollution, well, non-Landler Joy's bags might help in some of those cases, not in terms of how people get that land back, but in terms of producing food. But also, I mean, land remediation is necessary, regardless of whether it's going to be used for farming or not. We shouldn't be polluting our one home that we live on in the world. So I think we need to look at the ways of restoring and improving that land again. And then people can choose to do what they want with it if it's urban land and maybe it's not farming. There was a second half of that question around capitalist markets, but my notes don't make sense to me, if you want to remind me. But okay, yeah. So I mean, the thing is, I'm going to say about all of the questions that I can't necessarily answer them, but it's not up to me, it's up to everyone to answer them. Next round.
Okay.
Hi, so my name's Tana Makoka. I am not an expert on food security issues, but it's something that I find quite disturbing, and I come at this from having studied law. I actually came across two really hectic cases this year that made me think I need to actually read up more on this stuff. The one was a farmer who was coming to me with a case about they contracted to McCain. McCain gave them, there's a word for it, I can't remember the technical word, but it's like baby potatoes, basically, seedling type things that you put in the ground. And they could see from the beginning there's something wrong with this stuff. They complained to McCain. McCain didn't want to hear anything about it. They grew this stuff. By the time the harvest came to fruition, it was completely rotted. When they went back to McCain about it, McCain said, well, that's not our problem. So the cost of not being able to get the money for that harvest, plus the cost of now rehabilitating that land, comes to like 12 million rand. And then there was another case at the competition tribunal where, again, potatoes, a very small producer was trying to get out of a contract with a company that sells a particular variety of potatoes. And it was clear from the facts of the case that it was a highly exploitative relationship, that the contract, that they were actually trying to enforce a contract that should no longer be valid and trying to extract value beyond what is reasonable in terms of just, intellectual property law. In fact, intellectual property, I believe, is probably one of the root causes of a lot of the problems in the world, because I feel like it really drives this whole capitalist ethic, because you can again and again and again exploit people, So you've got the 3 R's, and I was wondering if we could add a 4th, and that would be like radical solidarity, because when I speak to farmers, it sounds like they're also between a rock and a hard place. Yes, they're part of the system, the food system, but they themselves don't actually want to be in it, but they literally don't have the money to get out of that system. And the legal implications of doing that are large. Farmers, from my looking at it, in the food system, they actually carry the brunt of the risk. And it's all the other players that get the benefits, but not the farmers. And they have very little wiggle room in terms of these exploitative contracts that they have. So I just wanted to get your comment on that, because you understand it much more broadly than what I do. And then my second recommendation would just be to maybe invest in, like, the ARC, which is a publicly owned organization that creates seeds. Could we maybe use that as a resource to think about, our food sovereignty? And I don't know if this is like pie in the sky, but like I say, I'm looking at this from a law perspective. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Yeah, my name's Karen. I don't work with food systems in any way, shape, or form, except for the vegetables in my garden. But I'm very concerned about the inequality and exploitation in the world, and it troubles me so much that I come and listen to things like this trying to get a grip on the root causes and what can be done. Many years ago, in the late 70s, for instance, in the European Union, there were things called butter mountains and milk lakes, because the farmers were producing so much that if they'd put everything on the market, they wouldn't make enough of a profit. And so all that butter and milk and probably a lot of other products were just dumped. They were destroyed while people were starving in so many parts of the world. How can human beings behave like this to everybody else? And in those days, I was sure that the solution was to ditch capitalism and bring in socialism, and that was going to solve all the world's problems. And now, 40 years later, I realize it's not quite as simple as all that. But anyway, so I just want to raise a couple of very big questions, Brittany, which, perhaps you can give a partial answer to. One has to do with food systems and land redistribution. Yes, you can give land back to people that were dispossessed. And what are they going to do about it? What are they going to do with that land? Because as you said early on in your presentation, that chain of passing knowledge from one generation to another has been broken. Many people wouldn't know what to do with the seed, how to bring it to fruition. And I'm not calling people stupid. It's just, that knowledge has been lost in many cases. So how do we get that knowledge back? And that's the second thing, how do you teach people not only about what to do with land, but different ways of eating? Our chef, Mantis, said that she didn't know about a lot of the products that she cooked today, and I think many people are the same. How do you get that knowledge back to people? How do you encourage small producers to grow cowpeas instead of growing beautiful red and green peppers or whatever? That might be a problem that could actually be tackled now. I think the land distribution problem is a bigger one, although it's related. And I do like flowers. I don't think you should give up on flowers altogether. You can have flowers and vegetables in the same plot.
In fact, flowers and vegetables go very well together. Okay, so we have only got 5 minutes left. I think I'm going to have to beg an extra 5 minutes from you guys just so that we can get these questions here and get a response from Brittany.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Siwe. Thanks so much for taking us back. I think it's really important to get some of the historical underpinnings of what we see today. A lot of what has been coming up, I think, in the questions is bringing me back to the concept of healing that I think we need to really take more seriously as South Africans in particular. I'm thinking healing around our relationship with the land, as you were speaking about, agricultural work was seen as punishment, but also healing with, like, in terms of our relationship with work altogether and healing the actual land because it's gone through a lot of, trauma itself. So I think just in response to the other sort of comments that you were posing just now around Chef Mantis not really being familiar or engaging with these foods and not knowing, I think the answer really is in that, is just being open to engaging with these foods, experimenting with them, working the land, and also almost like putting ourselves in a position where we can heal in terms of engaging with the food and the land. But I'm really interested in what you were speaking about in terms of kind of the system of production of food, because I've been doing a lot of research with people who are selling African food, so indigenous foods around the inner city. That's what my master's research is about. I'm coming from the perspective of urban planning and urban management. And a lot of the people who are selling these foods are speaking about the fact that they have to import even sorghum, which grows in South Africa, but there's no demand for it, so the farmers aren't going to grow it. So beyond the what we do in terms of trying to decolonize and bring these foods back in ways that can seem kind of artificial or kind of superficial, like window dressing the issue. We make nice lunches and pop-up restaurants, and we do food walks and all these things that seem to be trying to generate this interest around these foods, but it's not really tackling the core of these issues, which is that production value chain that you were speaking about. So I'm quite interested to hear from your perspective, firstly around what do you think is the role of like alternative food networks in kind of speaking back to this kind of system that's very set up and it's been long established that we feel like we don't almost have a say in it. So what is the role of like food sovereignty and alternative food systems in trying to change the system from almost like a bottom-up approach? And secondly, I'm quite interested in this picture. I'm really grateful that you ended with it. Quite interested in terms of how these communities that I would think sort of still have some kind of relationship with the land. Maybe historically they were able to maintain those kinds of relationships that have been important for them to be able to be sources of this kind of information. How has their almost experience been in terms of maintaining this relationship with the land, especially in the context of this healing that I'm speaking about, where people don't want to work the land because it's quite traumatic or it's laborsome and it's hard work and it's almost not worth it to be engaging in this kind of work. So I'm quite interested in terms of how their perspective were in those issues. Thank you.
Okay, I have 1 minute to answer 3 complex questions. The concept of healing is really of interest to me as well, in terms of healing ourselves and healing the land and healing, hundreds of years of trauma. And I think where to begin with that even. It speaks a bit to the other things as well. And I mentioned trauma in terms of punishment and things, but also the extreme exploitation of agricultural labor in this country for 400 years also means, and Mbuso knows this very well, people died farming potatoes. I don't know what it is about potatoes, which also are not indigenous. There's a lot of trauma related to the land, right? So there's a lot of healing that's needed. And I think the healing ideally would happen in like versions of collective rituals that are traditional rituals of healing that reconnect people to not only the land, but the traditions that were of the land. Canham's new book of Pondo Theory is a little bit about the rituals as well, reconnecting to the land. But part of the disruption, so I spoke about food today, but the disruption, as I said, was total, and one of the key aspects was health, right? And traditional ways of understanding health aren't this narrow box like the current sort of so-called modern medicine, where it's so specialized that you go to a doctor and they only know about this piece of your arm, right? And if something's wrong over here, forget it, it's another doctor. And traditional notions of health were so much broader and involved your physical health of your whole body, but that was linked to the ecological health, and that was linked to the health of your ancestors, and that was linked to the health of the land. And when you understand all of that together, then the healing can kind of happen all together as well, through rituals in community on the land. But that involves being able to be on the land, so that takes us back to the restitution. I think, if we look at the Amadiba community, it has been really hard for them to stay on that land. There are some sort of accidents of circumstance that have helped to enable them to be on that land all of this time and not be moved off it, like how inaccessible it is. But they have struggled and continue to struggle and die in order to stay on that land. So it's not easy. And then the maintaining of the traditions around food and foodways is incredibly difficult in the face of marketing and huge systems, all of which push you in another direction. And so elders say, no, the young ones are not interested. The young ones, their children, their grandchildren don't want to farm, don't want to eat the traditional dishes if they cook it. So then they have to cook 2 different meals. So then they just stop cooking the traditional dish. All of those other systems work to push people in one direction. And so we need to change all of those systems to enable us to move back in another direction. It's not just small pieces. And so I think our colleague over here who works in law might be developing a new specialty in potato law, which would be fascinating. But I agree on the problem of intellectual property, and the seed companies who have sought to patent life and nature and knowledge that was developed by indigenous people are basically just daylight robbers of traditional knowledge. So I would agree that we don't want intellectual property around life forms and seeds. And the farmers, it is true, even the large landholding white farmers in this country tend to have less power than the processors and the retailers. And so they are squeezed, and the inputs that they buy, they are squeezed, and they are struggling. And that is why we have been losing thousands of farms and seeing them get bigger and bigger as they are given up by the white farmers who had them and often shift into the control of financial companies who just invest in land and are not themselves farmers. However, I think that beyond solidarity, those farmers, as much as they are struggling, there are questions around how they got that land and whose land that should really be. And I think that if there's a goal of transforming the whole food system and producing in a way that is not toxic and that is not exploitative, then no one should have 50,000 hectares. There shouldn't be any plot of 50,000 hectares. And that would mean any individual farmer would have less land and would be producing in a different way. So, I mean, I'm with Karen's past 1970s view of overthrowing capitalism, absolutely. But it's true that what we put in its place is a little bit complicated at this point. And as long as people are wanting to eat these modern foods, as long as those are marketed to us as the best, as long as our minds, all of our minds, are colonized in this way, it's very hard for a small-scale farmer who still grows sorghum to find a place to sell it, and for a small-scale food seller to find the sorghum from the one farmer who's growing it somewhere. But I think in terms of making change, there was a question around how we get there, and it goes to the root of theories of change, and I don't have the answers there either. But I do think that these many small AFNs, which start as sites of privilege very often because only some people can afford to opt out of the supermarkets, but they also sometimes come in sites that are abandoned by capital, and so there are AFNs that are at the other end of the economic spectrum because people are excluded and abandoned by capital in sacrifice zones, and they therefore create their own food systems out of necessity, like in Detroit. So these crises, like climate change and COVID, which disrupt the global industrial food system, which is quite fragile and spread, we talked about the grain going to the pig, going to the whatever manufacturer to us, that all blows up in the face of climate change and COVID and any other disruption. And so in those cracks, we can grow the new system. But we need to be thinking about it. We need to be supporting the knowledge holders, enabling them to share their knowledge with many, many more of us so that we're all ready to grow the new system in the cracks as soon as they appear. So yeah, I think I will leave it there. Thank you all so much for coming.